Hey guys, welcome back to Alienation, or if you are new here, hi, welcome. So my name is Megan, and every Sunday, apart from last Sunday, I took last Sunday off, but every Sunday morning I sit down and talk about some form of weird and not so wonderful topic that really interests me. So this week, I'm actually going to be covering another true crime case. It is one that very much so fascinates me. That was really bad English, but I don't want to say I really love this case because that makes me sound a little bit twisted. But I am going to be covering a case that is quite well known. A lot of people here on YouTube specifically and on podcast streaming services have actually covered this case. But I'm going to do it anyway because I'm really interested in it and I want to talk about it. I am 100% going to get demonetized on YouTube for this episode because I will be showing a lot of crime scene photos. These photos are very wildly available. All it takes is a very quick Google search and they all come up. And there is quite a lot of them that are graphic ones as well. So if that is not something that you are interested in, this definitely won't be a video for you to watch. You are more than welcome to go and listen to this on a podcast streaming service. But just a little heads up, I will be showing a lot of crime scene photos. So goodbye monetization. So I would really appreciate it if you could interact with this episode. So give it a thumbs up. Leave me some comments and stuff just to help me out. But today we are actually going to be talking about the Lululemon murders. Most of you have probably heard about this if you're into true crime. It didn't happen that long ago when you think about it, but it is very popular because of the whole Lululemon brand that surrounds it. But before I get any further, I'm just going to put my little disclaimer in here because like I said, I am going to be including a lot of crime scene photos. There is a lot of graphic content in this one. Warning, today's episode contains descriptions, scenes and contents that some audience members may find disturbing. So viewer and listener discretion is advised. Firstly, if you don't know what Lululemon is, it is basically a very high-end yoga, clothing, fitness brand. As far as I'm aware, it's not a thing in the UK. You might be able to get shipping here in the UK, but it's not a thing. We don't have physical shops here of the Lululemon brand, but it is a very high-end brand. Like I said, it is hella expensive, as in, who the fuck is paying that much for a pair of yoga pants? I mean, it is absolutely insane. I mean, you spend your money on whatever the hell you want to spend your money on. That is completely fine. Me personally, hell no. And there is a whole dark side to Lululemon as well. I don't know if it is the person who owns it now, but apparently the creator or the person who owned it in the first place was exceedingly racist. They were also fattest. And by the sounds of it, they were not a nice person. There's a lot of dodgy business going on with that company. Again, if you want to look into it, go for it. But it is not a company I personally would want to be involved with. Before I get into a little rant that we just don't need today, this case took place in 2011 in a Lululemon store in America, hence why it is known as the Lululemon Murders. So let's get into it. There is a lot to this case. It might get a bit intense, so you might want a snack and a drink, but I'm ready. So going back to the morning of March the 12th, 2011, we are in Bethesda, which is in Maryland. It's like a little suburb, and this is in Washington, D.C., over in America, like I said. And there is, it's not a mall and it's not a shopping park, but it's kind of an area where there is loads of outdoor shops, if that makes sense. But there is a Lululemon Athletica store there. So this area is quite a nice area. It isn't one of the most expensive, bougie, luxury areas, but it is quite a well-off kind of area. So everyone who shops there has a little bit of dough. They've got a little bit of money. There's a lot of more higher-end shops, not fully designer shops, higher end shops. So obviously there's a Lulu's there, which I've just discussed is very expensive, and next door to that there is an Apple store. That Apple store does come into this case later on, but yeah, so that's the kind of shops that are there. And like I mentioned, it is a nice area. Not much goes on there. It's quite quiet. It's very peaceful. The crime rate is pretty much at zero. It is just an all-round nice area. So when the manager of that specific Lululemon store went to work that day, her name was Rachel, she arrived to obviously open up the shop and just get the day started. So this was probably just before 8 a.m. in the morning. She had her keys in her hand and she went to unlock the shop. However, what a manager does not want to witness when she first arrived to work that day is she found the shop already unlocked. Not unlocked because someone else had already beat her to it and unlocked the shop, but because the shop hadn't been closed the previous night. That is not a good thing. Like I said, it's quite an expensive shop. It's an expensive area. That is one thing the staff do know. If they are on the close, they lock the friggin' doors. I don't know if this is true or not, but apparently the lights were also left on in certain parts of the shop. So who fucked up? Who did not lock up right the day before? So probably just thinking that was what had happened. Someone had clearly just not done their job right. Rachel went in and she started to notice things didn't look very normal in the shop. Some things were kind of out of place. It wasn't anything too crazy, but it's not how the store would usually look. There were mannequins knocked over, a few of the folded items of clothing were all messed up. There were a few things on the floor, and this was starting to be a little bit suspicious in Rachel's eyes. So she worked her way further to the back of the shop. She noticed something that she did not want to see, and it appeared to be blood on the floor. So like any normal person would do, she panicked. She ran out of the shop and was like, I do not want to go in there. I don't know if anyone's still in there. It clearly looked like someone had been rifling around in the shop. So Rachel ran outside. She was clearly frantic, and she got straight on the phone to 911. Like I mentioned earlier, next door was an Apple store. So this was back in 2011, and at the time the iPad 2, I think it was being released. It was a brand new Apple product drop, and this was a big thing. So like normal, there was a queue of people outside the Apple store waiting for them to open so they could get their hands on this new product. I don't really know the specifics. I was under the impression that this man called Ryan was in the queue waiting to buy himself this new iPad. But when I was researching, I also found that there was potential that he could have worked there. I'm not too sure, but regardless, there was a queue of people and Ryan was around that queue. And Ryan, along with a lot of other people who were outside in this queue, had noticed Rachel and saw that she was distressed. So he, being the good citizen, he went over to make sure she was okay. And he actually offered to go into the store with her, you know, to kind of just check it out and see what had gone on. So after walking into the store, he noticed, similar to Rachel, a lot of the products were kind of out of place. The further in store he went, he noticed that all the cash registers had been ransacked. All the money was gone. There was no money left in there. There was receipts everywhere. I believe the safes were open as well, and there was no money in there. So clearly it looked like this Lululemon store had been burgled. But he didn't stop there, because obviously he could see the further towards the back of the store he went, things were just getting worse. So the first thing he noticed was bloody footprints everywhere. They just led to the back of the store, and there was a lot of them. So he kind of followed the trail to find more bloody footprints, to then find blood splatters, pools of blood, and just a bloody messy scene in general. It was noticed that some of the blood spatters were as high as 6 feet on the wall. It was just not a fun looking scene, and there was just stuff everywhere. So like I said, there was trails of blood, there was footprints, there was also drag marks across the floor, there was smeared handprints across the walls, and as he carried on looking, unfortunately he did come across a body at the back of the store. It was very clear that this body was dead. I know sometimes you just don't know, but from the state of this body, there was no question that this person was no longer here. So the body was lifeless, and it was face down in a huge, huge pile of what looks like their own blood, as in covered, not just a little pool, it was a huge amount of blood. He also quickly noticed that there seemed to be a rope around this person's neck as well. So clearly something more than a robbery had gone down here. So Ryan was about to head back towards the front of the shop to where Rachel was, to sort of tell her, you know, there's someone back here. And as he was on his way back, he passed an employee's bathroom. Just as he passed it, he heard moans coming from that room. He's so brave. I would have been absolutely terrified. So not only you've just seen something that's absolutely traumatic, you are then hearing potentially someone in that back bit of the store with you. Luckily though, it wasn't someone who was going to cause him harm, but he did find another woman lying on the bathroom floor. She had her hands tied together with zip ties, and they were above her head. She wasn't tied to anything in specific, but her hands were bound together, like I said, above her head. Her feet were also zip tied together, and she was just sort of laid in not a very nice way. So she had her t-shirt pulled up, her entire belly and midriff was on display, and she had gashes and slices all over her stomach. She was technically fully clothed, so she did have her leggings on, but again, her leggings were all slashed up and had rips and things in. She appeared to have a really bad wound of some sort on her forehead. She had cuts on her hands, cuts on her chest, but she did appear to be alive. Ryan noticed, like I said, she was moaning and she was breathing. So he ran straight out to Rachel, said, "You need to get an ambulance down here ASAP," because there was just frigging blood everywhere. So if she had been injured to cause so much blood, this could be life or death. She could bleed out. So the police eventually arrived, and they did unfortunately state that one of the women, to the first lady that I mentioned, was identified as Jaina Murray. I'm just going to talk a little bit about Jaina because she is a huge victim in this case, and she deserves so much better. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about Jaina. But Jaina was born November 22nd, 1980, which made her 30 years old at the time that this unfortunate event went down. I can't pronounce this, so I'm so sorry, but she was born in Kansas, I believe, in Wichita, to David and Phyllis Murray. So again, I'm sorry if I pronounce anything wrong in my cases. I am dyslexic as hell. But anyway, she did move to Texas and she did grow up in Texas. She was extremely intelligent, very well-liked person. She was really, really nice. You can't really say a bad word about her. She had a Bachelor of Science degree and she was extremely close to completing her master's, which she did in communication, I believe, and a master's in business as well. So she was working at the Lululemon store. She was a team leader, so she wasn't quite a manager, but she was someone who was a little bit higher up than your normal floor staff, if that makes sense. And people described her as a very, very nice person. She was very bubbly. She was extremely athletic. She loved to dance. She was adventurous. She loved animals. She loved to travel. She traveled so much in her life. She'd also studied in a lot of the places that she'd traveled. And overall, she was just a very great person. And something that is very, very sad, she had a long-term boyfriend at the time. His name was Fraser, and apparently a short while before this incident happened, he was looking at engagement rings for her because he really wanted to propose, which is heartbreaking. So moving on to victim number 2. So luckily she was still alive. She was identified as Brittany Norwood. Again, she was described as being really cheerful. She was very happy, bubbly. But she was born on May 19th, 1982, which made her 28 at the time. She was born in Seattle in Washington. She came from a huge family. She was one of 9 siblings, so she had a big family. They were all very, very close, and she had a very happy childhood and upbringing. She was very well educated. She wasn't spoiled, but she kind of had everything that she needed. Her dad owned his own business. So the family weren't rich or exceedingly well off, but they were very, very comfortable. And similar to Jaina, she was a good student. She was very much so into her sports. She kind of dipped her toes into everything. So she was a very, very strong girl, but her favourite sport was soccer, or we call it football here in the UK. She was very, very good, and that landed her a spot on her university team, which she absolutely adored. She wanted nothing more than to be on this football team, or soccer team. I do apologise. However, after Brittany had joined the soccer team, things just started going a little bit wrong. Random things started to go missing from the locker room. So nothing major, things that you could potentially misplaced, but enough for people to notice. So maybe perfume, a little bit of cash, jewelry, things that are easily misplaced, but you still don't want to be losing them. And the team did notice that this all happened kind of straight after Brittany had joined the team. So they confronted her, and it was her. She did confess. She broke down. She was very, very sad and emotional and apologetic. But once you kind of ruined that trust, I suppose if it had happened once, you'd be a bit like, oh, you're a dickhead, but that's fine. But if it was happening a lot, you're not going to really trust her either. So unfortunately, they did start to take her off more and more games, to the point where she was pretty much not on the team anymore. And this really, really hurt Brittany. She was devastated. Well, you shouldn't have been stealing people's shit then, should you, girl? Anyway, moving further down the line, Brittany did actually get a job at Lulu's, which is great. She seemed to be the perfect match for this job, just to help her save some money. But unfortunately, old habits die hard. She was still stealing, and she got caught stealing, so they fired her from this one. But then luckily the one in Bethesda did actually still hire her, and that's where she was at this current time. She was only an employee there for 6 weeks, I believe. It wasn't long at all in the lead up to this event. But Brittany's overall dream was to become a personal trainer and then eventually open her own gym. And sadly, a couple days after this incident, Brittany did actually have an interview booked. I think it was the Equinox I can't say it, Equinox gym, which again is very, very sad. So back to the day of the event, Brittany had sustained some injuries, like I said, across the stomach. She had gash marks and like little slice marks all over her, but there was a huge amount of blood all around her. Like I mentioned, she had this big gash on the top of her head, which clearly needed some attention. And again, I mentioned she had ripped leggings, so as if someone had been slicing at them. And sadly, the crotch part of her leggings had been cut away. So straight away, the police knew there was a sexual motive behind this attack. I don't know if it was her own shirt, because there are a lot of notes that she had a Lululemon top tied around her neck, but If you do look at the crime scene photos, it does kind of look like it's her own top that they've pulled up because she has got a sports bra on. Anyway, around Britney was just an absolute scene of chaos. There was a rock on the floor in the room that she was in, which was absolutely covered in blood. There was a shit ton of blood-soaked paper towels. There was spilt bottles of some sort. I think they were cleaning products. Decor was all over the floor, so there was like faux flowers. There was a Buddha statue or Buddha statue, depending on how you pronounce it. Overall, like I said, it was just an absolute messy scene. There was also a bloodied coat hanger there. It was just absolute chaos. And then going back to the scene of where Jaina was. Now, this is a little bit intense. It's quite horrific what Jaina went through, and no person should have to go through this. It is disgusting. She was pronounced dead at the scene, and like I mentioned, it was like a huge bloody mess. There is a lot to this case, but the fact that there was so much blood is one of the main things. So they actually found an open toolbox at Jaina's scene. The weirdest thing about this is this toolbox was on top of her body, which is very, very weird. And this toolbox actually did belong to this Lululemon store. It was store owned, but there wasn't many things left in it. Not a lot of the tools were inside the box. And that was because these tools were scattered all over the store, covered in blood, which kind of gives you an impression of the sort of injuries that the girls would have sustained. So all across the floor, there was this thin layer of blood, and then there were just these huge, bigger blood splatters on top of that everywhere else, but there was bloody footprints everywhere. There were some smaller footprints, which they presume could potentially have been female footprints, and then on top of them were huge bloodied footprints, which is that two attackers? Is that one of the girls? We don't know. Further along one of the corridors, there was a fire exit, and there was blood on that too. There's a lot on the handle, a lot on the door, but it was only on the inside. So they kind of realised that if any of the girls were trying to escape, or if anyone was going out that way and touched the door, they could only presume that whoever was trying to go out that way covered in blood didn't make it out that way. But it's one of those doors which, to disable the fire alarm, you have to put a key in it, and the key was actually in the door. So the police did take Jaina's body, and it was sent for an autopsy. And again, this is going to be quite graphic, so I'm very sorry, but Jaina actually sustained at least 331 separate injuries. At least. Oh my God, even counting to 331 is painful, let alone having to sustain that amount of injuries. It was, I guess, to an extent, because a lot of the wounds were on top of each other. So they found as many as they possibly could, but like I said, it could have just been wounds on top of wounds, and she could have sustained even more injuries than that. She'd been stabbed repeatedly. She had self-defense wounds, so she fought back. She was very brave. Most of these self-defense wounds were on her hands. She'd possibly been strangled by this rope, and she had been aggressively beaten. She was hella bruised. So they worked out that around 200 of these injuries were on her head and her neck. 200 in such a small area. But as you could probably imagine, there wasn't much left of Jaina's head and neck area, because the extent of the injuries and the amount of the injuries that she received, she had a minimum of 13 fractures to her skull, which incidentally resulted in her head caving in because there was just nothing left, which is absolutely disgusting. It's so sad to think about. And then the rest of the 100 and whatever injuries were kind of to her chest and her torso, and I presume there would have been some other injuries around, but that is where the main extent of the injuries were. They found clumps of her own hair in her hands. Again, I have no idea how that happened. If she's clearly putting up a struggle, her hair might have been ripped out, but either way, they found her own hair in her hands. And one of the saddest things is they believed, so like the pathologists and the people who carried out her autopsy, they believed that she was alive for most of this attack, which that's absolutely terrifying. I would like to think that she was unconscious for most of this, and hopefully she was, because if your body's going through so much, you do kind of just give in sometimes. So I do hope to God she was unconscious for most of this attack, but she was still alive through all of this until it came to one single final blow. That was a single stab wound to the back of the neck. This blow actually severed her spinal cord, which killed her instantly, and that was the final blow. So the fact that she managed to endure all of that and still survive is absolutely insane. They also found that a minimum of 5 weapons was used on her body. They believed a Buddha statue, which was found at the crime scene, a hammer, a wrench, the rope that was around her neck, and possibly some other tools. Jumping back to Brittany, obviously she was still alive, so they had to rush her to hospital. If she was in a similar state to Jaina, she was not going to be looking great at all, so they had to rush her down to hospital, get her checked up, and make sure that she was okay. However, Brittany only had superficial wounds. She was in nowhere near as bad shape as Jaina. She was pretty much okay. I know that sounds really bad. Traumatized, but okay. She was covered in these like surface scratches. Again, if you've seen the photos, you'll get what I mean. They remind me of like aggressive looking cat scratches. And she only really needed cleaning up, and they tended to the 2 injuries that actually needed more care, if that makes sense. One of them was a gash right in the middle of her forehead, right at the top of her scalp line, which is a very strange place to be hit on the head, like directly in the middle. I shouldn't be laughing, but either way, if you know anything about head injuries, even if you have the smallest head injury, it bleeds like a motherfucker. And then she also had one on her hand, which was kind of in between her index finger and her thumb. But she was okay. She was conscious and she was able to talk. It's very, very vital for the police to do their job ASAP, and luckily they did. They got straight on with questioning Brittany because she was able to. There was other injuries that Brittany did talk about. Brittany unfortunately mentioned that she had also been raped. The police were kind of aware of this because of the cutout in her leggings, so straight away they had a rape kit done, so that was all sent off and they had to just wait for the results of that to come back. So this is where the police questioned Brittany, and they got her first count of the events that unfolded that night. So Brittany and Jaina were finishing up their shift. It was just a normal shift, just like a normal close, a normal finish. They grabbed their stuff, they locked up, and they both left. Jaina was driving home that night and Brittany was heading towards the subway, train station, I don't know, public transport kind of direction. And when she finally got there, she realised she had left her Metro card at the shop. Jaina's pretty much already on the way home, and she didn't have Jaina's number, so she kind of phoned around all the other girls, basically saying, has anyone got Jaina's number? I need to go back to the shop. Eventually she got hold of Jaina, and luckily, well, not luckily, it's not luckily in the slightest, but Jaina had also forgot her laptop, so she was like, yeah, that's completely fine. I will head back to the shop and I will meet you there. So they both headed back, and Jaina just pulled up outside the store. She kind of parked illegally. She just left the car there. Most of the shops in the area were closing up because it was getting quite late. It was around 10 p.m. So she was only rushing in to grab some things. Like, it doesn't really matter. She just sort of left her car outside. The girls headed in. Jaina grabbed her laptop, but Brittany could not find her Metro card to save her life. So Jaina joined in, trying to find this blooming Metro card so she could go home. They couldn't find it. It was nowhere in sight. Jaina basically just said, look, here's my Metro card. Use this, take that home, and we'll sort it out another day. So Brittany was like, okay, great, thank you. That's amazing. However, as they had rushed in, they clearly hadn't locked the door behind them because they were only nipping in. When they turn around to leave, so Brittany states that she was behind Jaina. They both noticed the front door is wide open. They did not leave it wide open, but it was wide open. 2 men out of nowhere who were hiding behind the clothes racks and the clothes rails jumped out and grabbed hold of Jaina. They were both wearing all black, and Brittany stated that they were wearing ski masks. So obviously she couldn't see what they looked like. So because Jaina was at the front, they did grab her first, like I said. And Brittany was able to tell that one of the guys was about 6 feet tall, and the other one was noticeably smaller. He was around 5'3" to 5'5". And the taller guy did end up dragging Jaina away. So he hit her in the head and dragged her away to the back of the shop with her hair. And then the shorter guy dragged Brittany by her hair towards the cash register to nick all the money. Then after this had happened, Brittany was then dragged to the back of the shop, and her attacker zip tied her up. So like I mentioned, hands and feet were both zip tied. She had no idea what was happening to Jaina, and this guy tortured her. Like we've seen, she was covered in little slash marks, so he wasn't aiming to kill her. He was just sort of slowly, bit by bit, hurting her. Brittany also said that during the attack, he was shouting racist slurs and statements at her, just being overall an absolute arsewipe to her. And she did believe that both of these attackers were potentially white males, mostly due to their dialect, to their chosen racism. Brittany also said that her attacker claimed to know her full address, basically saying, I know where you live, threatening her and all that lot. So it could have been a personal targeted attack. And that was when he apparently raped her. He then left her there, but then returned back with a coat hanger and sexually assaulted her with this coat hanger. All the while she could hear Jaina screaming in the background, but those screams did eventually start to die down. So this next bit is just sick. So Brittany's attacker apparently then dragged Brittany into the same room as Jaina, where Jaina unfortunately had already passed away, and he threw Brittany on top of Jaina's dead body. Fucking sick, isn't it? And apparently the men yelled at her, again they were being really racist, and they said they were going to spare her life because apparently she, quote, was more fun to fuck, unquote. Seem like lovely gentlemen, don't they? And then she was dragged back into the staff bathroom and she was just thrown in there and left. And that was kind of what she recalled from that night. Brittany felt awful. She was obviously a bit of a mess, crying her eyes out, and she was blaming herself for this entire event. Basically, if she hadn't have left her card, none of this would have happened. And she just kept recalling over and over and over again how much blood was at the scene. And she wasn't aware that Jaina had already passed away. So she kept asking the nurses and the police how her friend Jaina was doing. So immediately the police went to town, they got to work. This is an intense case. It is in an area that nothing happens there. It was a very strange thing to happen in this area. Everyone was terrified. The media got hold of it straight away. So they were like, we need to get this like sorted ASAP. These people could still be out there. It could happen again. Like I said, it is quite a nice area. So instantly they thought we need to check for cameras. We need to get everyone CCTV. But no shops had CCTV. This is 2011. CCTV was a thing. Like, it wasn't back in the day where cameras didn't exist. And this is a nice freaking area. I'm sorry, but if you're charging over £100 or $100 for a pair of leggings, but you can't afford to put CCTV in your shops, what are you doing? That just baffles me. Like, none of y'all have cameras. What the fuck is that about? Luckily, one shop in the area did actually have a camera, and thank God it was the Apple store next door. It wasn't the best CCTV or the best camera, but it was better than nothing. And funnily enough, when they collected the footage of that night, they hit the jackpot. It captured two men dressed all in black heading towards the Lululemon store. And it was around the same time too. Bingo. All they've got to do now is identify them. So the police carried on doing their thing. They were looking for witnesses and they headed into the Apple store because the Apple store was actually open around the same time that the Lululemon store was open. They wanted to question some of the staff that were closing that night. This really pisses me off. I'm not going to lie. I can't speak for anyone in any form of situation, but dear God, this is not how to act in this situation. But anyway, there were some people in the Apple store, and there was a girl specifically called Jaina, and she heard squeals, she heard screaming, she heard banging, she heard what she claimed sounded like dragging noises, basically a lot of absolute chaos, and what kind of sounded like a horror film going down next door. She also stated that she heard two women's voices specifically. First time she heard this voice speak, she heard, "Please don't do this, just talk to me." And the second time she heard, "God help me, please God help me." Obviously she was like, what is going on? So she went and told one of the security guards that was working that night. His name was Ricardo, and he could also hear it. And he even chose to put his ear to the wall to listen. He could also hear how loud it was. And instead of doing something about it, he decided to bang on the wall. You know, like if you had really loud neighbours and you'd be like, shut the fuck up. Kind of like that. And it apparently works. It then went quiet and they just got on with the rest of their evening. That's it. They didn't call the police. They did fuck all about this. Absolutely nothing. If you ever come across a situation like that, call the motherfucking police. It might have just sounded like a domestic, but you are in a store. You heard screaming. I'm going to have to move on because it will really infuriate me, but that is not, like, that's not how you act. And I'm not blaming them in the slightest, but if they'd done something about this, Jaina could potentially still be alive today. I'm just saying. So they were hearing these noises around the 10 p.m. mark. But then after obviously carrying on speaking to people, the police found out that Rachel had actually spoken on the phone to Jaina at around 10 p.m. So at this point, she clearly was still alive. So they were trying to narrow down a time slot, you know, like they do. They try and figure out when crimes went down. They got Rachel to check the alarm log to see when the girls could potentially have been in and out of the store. They noticed it was set at 9:45 p.m. and then it was disarmed at 10:05 p.m. So they potentially believed the crime was in between the 10:05 p.m. and the 10:15 p.m. because that's when the noises were going down. So like I said, Jaina had driven there. She parked the car outside. Crime went down. Neither of the girls had left. So where was the car? Had the attackers stole the car? So the search for the car started. It can't have just disappeared. So Detective Reuben, who was in charge of this investigation, got everyone together and was like, yo, this is the car we're looking at. And straight away, an officer said, I've seen that car. I know exactly where it is, or I did know exactly where it is the night of this murder. It didn't stand out as in the car stood out, but it had Texas plates, so the plates kind of stood out. We had noticed it was parked quite a few blocks away in a car park. The lights were on at this time that he had seen it, and someone was in this car, and this was around 12:30. So 2 hours later, after this attack had gone down, this car was spotted with someone inside it. And he ended up passing it again a few hours later, so around 2 a.m. this time. But this time the car was off, there was no lights on, and it was empty. So because they knew where it was and the guy luckily remembered where it was, the car was found and it was taken in for forensics, and they had to just wait for forensic results to come back. So while they were waiting for those results, they looked back into the whole CCTV thing that they were after, and even though they had footage and proof of these apparent attackers, there wasn't much more to it. You couldn't really see their faces. You could only sort of see the backs of them walking away because they were just walking past the store. So Detective Reuben was like, I've got a plan. We are going to scout out this location. There's so many angles that police work can take, and this was something they chose to do, and luckily they did because it did pay off. He chose to stake out this street. He sat in his car and he basically waited, because a lot of the time criminals do actually return to the scene of their crimes. And luckily enough, two men dressed in black, one taller than the other, started walking by. Gotcha. So Reuben went over and basically was like, hello guys, is this you? He showed them at the CCTV stills. They were like, yeah, that's us. It's like they just walked straight into their hands. Done and dusted. However, it turns out these two men were waiters who worked in a restaurant that was kind of near the Lululemon store. And they were just on their way home from work like they do most night. Unfortunately, it wasn't them, and they were back to square one. So they reached out to the public again, asking people to come forward with information, if anyone had any idea as to what was going on, if anyone had any leads, just anything. Please help us. And they were constantly obviously going through the crime scene evidence, going through forensics, whatever they could to try and get this case sorted. And during this search, they came across a pair of trainers. These trainers matched some of the footprints that were found at the crime scene. These were no ordinary pair of trainers. These were size 14 pair of trainers. They're big ass shoes. Not many people wear that size. Or do they? Maybe they do. I don't know. It's a big ass shoe. And this shoe had been ditched at the scene. So they were like, perfect. The killer has ditched their trainers. This will narrow it down a little bit. So there was a guy called Keith who was a homeless man. He hung around in this Bethesda area. He was quite well known to a lot of the people around there because of his bad temper, and he had a very aggressive nature, specifically towards women. And quite a few people brought his name forward. They suspected it could potentially involve him. He is homeless, so he does carry around a lot of spare clothes in his backpack. So it would kind of make sense if he ditched the shoes at the scene, because he would have others to put on. So someone had also told the detective that they believed they'd seen Keith walking around in that area around the time of the murder, and he was wearing all black. And apparently he was also seen with another man. He was seen with a white man who was also wearing black. You might think that this is quite normal, but Keith kind of stuck to himself, so it was a little bit strange that he suddenly had an accomplice. A bit weird, that Keith. But anyway, they were able to find Keith. Homeless people are obviously harder to find because they don't have a permanent address, but they did find him in hospital 10 miles away from Bethesda, and he was covered in blood, bruises and injuries. It's not looking good for Mr. Keith. So they did actually arrest him and take him to the station, but they didn't have grounds to arrest him on regards to this case because they had no evidence it was him. But luckily, there was a warrant out for his arrest for another crime that he committed, so they could arrest him for that, but could question him for this, if that makes sense. But again, it was another dead end. because Keith had got into a fight with another homeless man. It was injuries from that. It wasn't because he'd taken down these two girls. And the police could kind of tell, like, due to the state of him, not only physically, but also mentally, something wasn't quite right. He clearly was struggling. They just didn't think he was capable of committing such a crime. But they did take his clothes to test it just to be sure, and it didn't match anything from the crime scene. There was nowhere near enough blood on him. So again, back to square one. We're going to have to look back over all of the evidence. They had sort of a clearer mind, and they were looking down different paths, and they realised that not everything was adding up. There was a lot of inconsistencies. So, for example, the toolbox that was found, it belonged to the store. So that meant that the attackers chose to either not bring their own weapons and hope to God there would be something around the store that they could use, or they brought their own weapons and chose not to use them. Did they know that the toolbox was going to be there? They also found a huge pack of zip ties that belonged to the store, and these zip ties matched the same ones that were used on the victims. Did the attackers know that the store had these too? Bit weird that as well, isn't it? Well, how would they have known the store was even open? Because like I said, the store had closed, they'd finished the shift. So technically the girls wouldn't have been there. So it clearly wasn't calculated beforehand. And it's not like random people walk down the street and go like, hey look, there's girls in there, the door's open, fancy committing a murder? Like, no. And none of it was adding up. And also the injuries didn't make sense. So Jaina had suffered so many injuries with so many different murder weapons being used. So the person was swapping weapons constantly, which is very weird. And looking at the huge difference between the two girls, Jaina was a mess. She had to suffer so badly, but Brittany got a lot less compared to what Jaina got. The shoe prints didn't make sense. Why was there only one small footprint and one big footprint? There was 4 people there. Shouldn't there be 4 sets of footprints? So pathologists did suggest that the crime took around 17 to 20 minutes, as in Jaina's initial attack. So if you think about it, that's a long time. Think of the sheer brutal force that someone was using to hurt Jaina with for that long amount of time. That must be exceptionally tiring. Stabbing someone, beating someone, hurting someone, it does take a lot of toll on you. It's not an easy thing to do, even though killing someone, unfortunately, is quite easy. It's also kind of difficult. There's muscle, there's bone, there's human tissue that you've got to get through. So to be doing actions over and over again for 20 minutes and creating that amount of injuries, that's a lot. That's a lot to put yourself through. So it was very, very obvious that this killer was just in a blind fit of rage. Adrenaline has to have taken over, and you just kind of have to black out to sort of do something like this, because you physically wouldn't be able to do it. And it doesn't match the MO. It doesn't match the MO of a robbery in the slightest. No one goes, let's go and rob this store and also violently destroy this human. It makes no sense. There was no sign of people leaving. Where did the attackers go? The front of the store wasn't even that messy or even that bad. Not that much was out of place. It was an expensive store. If they're robbing stuff, you'd expect them to take a few pairs of leggings or something. I don't really know. How did the car disappear randomly? Also, how did the Apple employees only hear 2 women's voices? What about the guys? It was 2 male attackers. Why didn't they not hear them? And didn't Brittany say that they were yelling racist shit at her? So they didn't hear that? They didn't hear them yelling her address at her? None of it's making sense. So the police carry on with their questioning, just trying to build some form of a story and timeline, figure out what's going on. And they spoke to Rachel again, which, if you remember, store manager who found the shop like that, she basically informed them that the shoe that they had found, so them big ass shoes, that they were irrelevant. She was like, oh, don't worry about them. They belong to the shop. Lululemon obviously sells activewear, yoga stuff, and if people show up that day to try on clothes and they don't have the right footwear, anyone can lend these sort of shoes in the store just to try them on, just to see what the outfit looks like. And they have this huge ass pair because that way they know it's going to fit most people. So that would potentially mean that the suspects, so the people who did this, swapped out their own shoes for the store's one, wandered around in them, committed these crimes, traipsing bloody footprints everywhere, and then discarded them now, which is a bit fucking weird. Brittany Hunt, what's going on? So thinking back to her injuries, where she didn't sustain anything anywhere near as bad as Jaina, the police were starting to think, could Brittany have been in on this? So once again, they wanted to question Brittany, just find out more about her, build a little case, not a case, but a profile on Brittany, just to figure out something to help with this case. So the one thing they found out was there was a lot of theft going on around Britney. So if you think back to when she was a bit younger, when she was playing football, she was stealing and all that jazz. There was a lot more to it. Britney also was a little bit of a liar. Britney had never graduated, but she had told all of her friends and her family that she had graduated. It turns out she'd been kicked out of college. It also turns out Britney had a babysitting job, and she was babysitting for this family for quite a while. But unfortunately, stuff around the house started going missing, and a lot of the mum's jewellery collection was going missing. She'd scammed her friends out of money to the point where her own roommate and her own friend used to give her rent and she'd then pay the rent. Does that make sense? And she basically turned around and said, look, the rent's gone up, you need to pay me more. It hadn't gone up. So Britney was just pocketing the extra. So she scammed a friend then. She'd scammed a beauty salon. She was just kind of scamming people she knew out of money, stealing shit here and there wherever she could. But anyway, Britney did have an ex-boyfriend at the time. She basically started stalking him, texting him and his new girlfriend, stalking her as well, to the point where she even broke into their new home and stole a bunch of their things. He did eventually file a restraining order against her, but straight away she violated that, and she violated it multiple times. Followed him home, showed up outside his house, all that shit. Just a little bit weird. And then obviously from speaking to Rachel a lot, they found out she did actually abuse her staff privileges quite a lot. Bear in mind, she was only at that shop for about 6 weeks, and they do obviously offer their staff things like discounts, treats, freebies, all that jazz, and she was heavily abusing that sort of treatment and rewards. Lululemon basically have these shop events for the staff where they can get 70% off everything, which is a huge discount, especially when you think about how much this stuff is. However, it was capped at $1,000, and Britney basically asked if she could go over that a little bit because she was saying she needed more work uniform because they had to wear Lulu stuff. So Rachel, being Rachel, was like, yeah, that's fine, go for it. However, Britney pushed that to $2,000. Fuck me. This bitch is dropping $2,000 on Lululemon sportswear when it's already 70% off. So she basically was just taking advantage wherever she could. And unfortunately, as time was going on, as Britney was working there, the staff there suspected that she was stealing. And would you be surprised? I mean, I wouldn't. So not only did they think she was stealing shop items, so obviously merchandise, clothes and all that lot, but they also thought she was stealing other people's belongings. So the other staff members, like all those niggly bits she used to steal. She's kind of doing that again. So the higher up people, so kind of like your managers and everyone, this included Jaina, they all held a meeting to kind of discuss Britney's future at Lululemon. And they basically just said if she's caught stealing again, then that would pretty much be the end of her job there. Like, she's done, we can't deal with this anymore, which is completely fair enough. The fact she didn't get fired straight away is weird. It also came to light that Jaina and Britney weren't the best of friends around the time of the murder. The police also learned that Jaina had phoned Rachel the day before the murder, and Jaina basically said, look, I suspect that she has stolen something again, which would mean that if she had, then she's out. So the shop basically had this policy, which is fair enough because the products do cost a lot of money, where if you are an employee there, at the end of every shift, your bag has to get searched to make sure you have not been stealing stuff. And the day before the murder, Jaina basically thought that she had noticed Britney pinching a pair of yoga pants and putting them in her bag. And obviously, no one wants to be in that situation where you confront someone, but she kind of had to. So instead, she said, oh, can I do your bag search, please? And Britney said no. Britney was like, no, it's fine. This employee over there has already done it. It's been searched. It's fine. So Jaina had to go and ask the employee and the co-worker, basically say, like, have you already searched her bag? And she said, no, I haven't. Again, not looking very good for Britney, is it? Luckily, around this time, the forensic results from the car did finally come back. So first of all, they found Jada's blood and Britney's blood in the car, which would kind of make sense if the attackers had attacked the girls and then got in the car, so fair enough. However, they also found a baseball-style cap, and this is when it gets a little bit strange. So think back to Britney's injuries. She had that big-ass one on her head, right by the hairline on her forehead. They found blood on this hat, and it was right where your forehead would sit in this cap. oh shit. So she could possibly have been in on this. So they brought her in for questioning once again. It didn't sort of let her know that she was a suspect. And they asked her about the car one more time. And she said, that's all I know. I just know she parked it outside and I don't know much else about the car. That's basically it. So they chose to ask her again about the zip ties. And this time she said she remembered seeing one of the attackers get the zip ties out of his backpack. And the police were like, no, they're from the store, hun. Nice try. She obviously panicked. She sort of tried to backpedal a little bit and she was like, oh no, I'm just struggling. Maybe they were from the store. Maybe I just thought he got them from the backpack. I'm just very, very overwhelmed. I don't want to talk. Can I go home? It was not looking good in the slightest, but the police looked back over her injuries from that night and they got experts to sort of come in and analyse all of the evidence again. And the experts did say that one of her injuries was consistent with her grabbing a knife. So like I mentioned earlier, she had an injury between her index finger and her thumb. It was consistent with her potentially grabbing a knife blade. If you think about it, if she was holding it with two hands, it was very slippy from lots of blood, potentially. We know there was a lot of blood at the crime scene. This could have potentially caused her hand to slip where she's grabbed the wrong bit of the knife. So how is that possible? If she was being attacked, when is she grabbing a knife in her story? I don't know. They also basically said her head injury was also consistent with being bashed, which makes sense, but it was in a weird place. It's in right in the middle of her forehead. So again, they think she possibly could have been holding a knife, holding an object with two hands, and she's like aggressively going up and down. She could have potentially smacked herself in the head with whatever she was using. It wouldn't surprise me if she's absolutely decked herself in the head, in all honesty. So Detective Rubin had all this evidence and he was like, yo, this is the case I'm building up. I think she did it. I honestly think Brittany's involved. So he laid all of this evidence on the table to his team. Are you ready for this evidence? Are you ready? The injuries weren't consistent with the story. All weapons were from the shop. Not a single thing was brought in. Not a single thing went out. Everything was found at the crime scene and it was all from the shop. So Brittany claimed that both the girls were attacked and that both the girls were then just left there. So how did a cap that matched her injuries get into Jaina's car, which was then found at a different location? And how was the car moved? Did the car just drive itself like a transformer? I don't think so. And then at this point, Brittany's rape results came back. Turns out she was not raped. Don't be joking about this stuff, guys. So again, story was inconsistent. They reworked and relooked over the forensics, like I said, and it turns out the zip ties that were used to tie up Brittany had teeth marks in them. Do you know what that means? She did it herself. She tied her own ankles and then used her teeth to tie the zip ties on her hands. So they found teeth marks in the zip ties, which basically means she put them on herself and then used her teeth, pulled them tight. That's looking good. Next, I'm reading my notes because there's a lot of this. Her hands and her arms were found above her head. She was conscious, and this was a very uncomfortable position to lie there for hours and hours and hours. Because what was it, around 10ish that it apparently happened, and she was found 8 a.m. the next day. That's a long time to have your arms above your head. A normal person would bring them down, and she'd be found with them in a more comfortable position. So it basically means it was posed. Help me. So next, the blood. It didn't look natural. When they re-looked over it, it all kind of looked like it was placed there. Not around Jaina, around Brittany. So Brittany obviously didn't have enough injuries to cause that amount of blood. So when they re-looked over the crime scene photos, they noticed these paper towels that were completely soaked in blood. So basically looked like she'd used the paper towels to soak up some of Jaina's blood and then wipe them all around where she was to make it look like her own injuries and her own blood. So next, the footprints. The footprints were a huge part of this case. I'm not going to get into it too much, but basically the little footprints were the first laid footprints. And then the bigger ones were the ones that were on top. They believed there was a possible shoe swap to cover up these footprints. And obviously Brittany knew that these shoes were in the store, so it kind of makes sense. Then they looked at her injuries again and realised that most of her injuries would have been self-inflicted. So a lot of the angles in which her cuts were and her injuries were related to someone who had done it themselves. The main detective was like, Brittany's the killer. And then weirdly enough, Brittany decided to show up. She's like, hello, remember me? And she claims that she'd remembered stuff from that night, which is great. She claimed that the men had forced her to move Jaina's car because obviously it was going to be outside, it was going to be a dead giveaway. They'd forced her to move the car, so go through Jaina's things, take the keys, move the car, and then walk back to the store. If that is true, at that point, you are getting in that car and you are going, see ya, and you are driving your ass straight to the police station. But no, Jaina said they threatened to kill her if she didn't come back. So she went back. I call big ass bullshit. And obviously the police at this point were like, oh, do you know what? Let's just confront her. We don't believe you. We know you're lying. We've got evidence against you. And obviously Brittany was like, oh shit. So she starts crying. She gets all defensive. She's like, no, I promise you it wasn't me. And they basically start piling all the evidence against her, to which she then shuts down completely. She very quietly just asks, can I go home now? So they use the tactic where they go, okay, we'll take a break. And then they go away, they come back, and then they re-interrogate her again. But this time when they go back in, they actually take one of her brothers and one of her sisters in with them. So Chris and Marissa, her siblings, were in there with her, and once again they re-go through all the evidence. And this was clearly a huge struggle for the siblings to hear. Marissa had to leave because she couldn't put up with it. She got way too upset. So the police basically said, right, we'll leave you alone with your brother. We'll go make sure your sister's okay. Just give you some alone time. Chris basically says to her, you need to tell me right now, did you do it? And multiple times he asks her, she denies it every single time, until eventually she says, quote, I don't want to talk about it here, unquote. You fucking guilty bitch. Like, if you were innocent, you would swear down to your grave that you were innocent. And no, she says that, which pretty much is enough for the police to go, we've got her. So exactly 1 week later from when Jaina was murdered, so now March 18th, 2011, Brittany was arrested on suspicion of murder. Good. But this was a huge shock to everyone because Brittany was another victim in this case. So what was the motive? Why did she do it? Why did she kill her? So the police believe her motive was that Brittany had figured out that she was basically going to get fired because of this whole stealing. She'd been caught stealing again. And she was kind of scared that her entire future was just at stake. It was just going to dissipate because she had this interview for not necessarily her dream job, but it was a step towards her dream job, if that makes sense. And obviously if she was caught stealing, she probably wouldn't have got the job because it would be on her record, or they'd phone up Lululemon to be like, oh, is she a good person to hire? And they'd be like, no, she's been fucking stealing. She was really panicked. She got really, really angry. Maybe they confronted each other. And either way, Jaina unfortunately was murdered. And it was a fucking savage crime. It's not even like a little accident argument gone wrong. That is a full-on blind, savage murder. So in between the time of her getting arrested and sort of her trial, Brittany didn't really act normal. I mean, if you're on trial for murder, we don't really know how you're going to act, but at the same time, the last thing you're going to be worried about is your appearance. But not Brittany. That's the only thing she cared about. She's like, oh, my hair's a mess. Oh, I don't look great. I can't do my makeup. That's all she complained about to friends and family who phoned her, which is not a good look. It's not what you should be complaining about when you're about to get done for murder. So her defense lawyer was like, she's obviously guilty. It's a very tough one to defend. Like a lot of lawyers, he went down the mental health route and was like, we're just going to claim you're very mentally ill. And he basically stated that no sane person or someone in a right frame of mind could have done this. He said it wasn't premeditated. She didn't plan on doing it. It was just a complete snap in her mental state. It was just last minute, just happened. I know, I'm sorry, I don't believe that bullshit. I'm sorry. If you believe that, I completely respect that, but personally, I think that's fucking bullshit. She knew what she was doing. Of course she fucking did. So sure, she probably has issues. I mean, if you go through all that, fair enough. If you're just putting it down to mental illness, and nah, I don't believe that. I'm sorry. But luckily, the prosecution had a shit ton more evidence on her, and it just kept piling up and piling up and piling up. One of the things that came out was the fact that Brittany had chose to move the car. But the reason behind her moving the car was what is like, oh, okay. So apparently Brittany only moved it because Rachel, the manager, only lived across the street. So if at any point Rachel got up in the night or was still awake and looked out, she could have seen the car outside. And that's why she moved it, because she didn't want Rachel to see it. So she moved it, went back, headed back there, and just staged the crime scene. I don't know. It's just so weird. Not many people were in favour of Brittany, I'm afraid. And when it came to deliberation, the jury only deliberated for less than an hour, which is very, very, very quick. It usually takes a lot longer than that. But they knew she'd done it. They were like,
it's Brittany, bitch.
So she was guilty. Yep, they found her guilty and she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. They thought she was far too dangerous to go out, and that is where we are today. She's in prison. So to conclude, what the fuck? Like, it's such a bizarre case to brutally kill someone potentially over a pair of fucking leggings. Mind blown. Anyway, it is a very interesting case, but it is so sad. It is absolutely heartbreaking. But on a weird positive note, the Lululemon shop is still open, and they have put a stained glass mural above, like, art thingy above the door, and it's really bright and colourful, and it says loving it, just kind of in a tribute for Jaina, and people always take flowers there. Absolutely heartbreaking, but please let me know your thoughts down below on this case. I would love to hear. But that is everything. Thank you so much for joining me this week. If you are watching on YouTube, thank you. Please give it a massive thumbs up, leave me a comment down below, and subscribe if you are not. Also leave any case suggestions you want me to cover, or any topics. It can be literally anything weird, spooky, unusual. Let me know. If you are listening on podcast streaming services, thank you so much to you guys as well. Please rate, review, share, everything you can do to help. That would be amazing. I will catch you in my next one. Bye.